So, welcome back to the latest lecture session. Again, a very quick recap of what we have been up to, right? We were looking at, I believe, surfactant based extraction of relevant contaminant, right? And in that context, we looked at the relevant calculations, let's see, and then moved on to looking at a particular case study for which we had some data available online, right, or in the public domain. And the case was relating to, again, a particular army site in the US, let's say, or army base, right? And again, the solvent or the contaminant that we are looking at here is again the solvent which is PCE, which is used for, let's say, dry cleaning purposes and so on. So, the particular case or case study that we were looking at was regarding a particular pilot scale study, right, and we looked at the relevant aspects and so on. So, a very quick recap of what are some of the aspects that we discussed, right. So, here again they had particular DNAPL, right, at the bed of a particular impermeable or on the top of a particular impermeable layer. And what are we trying to do, or what are they trying to do? They are going to inject surfactant, let's say, and through different hydraulic control, let's say, they are going to flood this particular system with the relevant surfactant, and that is going to dissolve this DNAPL. So, this is the actual, it is not the dissolved PCE, but the PCE that is present as PCE itself, right, say, or the non-aqueous phase liquid, let us say, right. So, that is what we are trying to remove, and then they are going to try to pump this out, right. And again, I believe they also looked at relevant aspects, right, before we go further. So, this is the relevant PCE NaPl, let us say, right, or the DNAPL that they are looking at, and the DNAPL consists of the PCE primarily, let us say, right. And the plume, once that groundwater is contaminated, I believe this is the one for the contaminant plume for 2 ppb levels, let us say, right. Again, but this is not the what they were trying to look at. They were trying to look at remediating this particular or part of this particular DNAPL, let us say, right, and to see if it is effective or not, and if it can be what we say scaled up to scaled up from pilot scale, right. So, let us look at what else we have, right. We have a DNAPL zone, and again, as we mentioned, beneath a particular building and at relatively shallow depth, if I may say so, right, and occurs immediately above and within a relatively low permeability layer of silty sediments. So, as we were just discussing, we have a relatively impermeable layer, and the DNAPL exists right on top of it, or it has already permeated a bit into this particular impermeable layer, let us say, right. So, that is what we have. Again, why is that important? Because obviously, you know, the extracting it is going to be an issue now, right, especially if the permeability is relatively low, right. So, let us move on. So, what was the flow chart? So, they looked at electrolytes, surfactant, and also solvent. I believe they have some solvent, isopropyl alcohol, right. They looked at they were injecting these three, a mixture of these three particular aspects, and you know, injectors, right, they were injecting it. They were trying to have some level of hydraulic control, and then they were flooding the relevant aquifer with the relevant surfactant, which was injected through these injectors, and then obviously they were extracting the relevant surfactant. And then you have first phase separator, where DNAPL is removed, let us say, right. Here, why are we looking at all these relevant aspects here? They were trying to recycle the relevant surfactant, let us say, right. Again, feed tank, so pervaporation, I believe we looked at that in very or little detail, or did not spend much time. More or less, I believe, without adding, let us say, anti-foaming agents or such, they are trying to remove the relevant or get or extract the relevant surfactant, and in that case, let us say, or scenario, they were looking at pervaporation, right. And again, you have this particular recovered tank, right, and then the surfactant is recycled, let us say, right. So, that is what we have here, and this is the relevant what we say DNAPL that can be treated further now that it is relatively more concentrated, let us say, right. So, that is something to keep in mind, right. So, what are we trying to look at? We are trying to bring down the NaPl to average residual saturation of 0.05%, let us say. I think it was around 2 or 4%, right, and I think 14% by weight or so on. But again, here we are bringing that down to 0.05%, let us say, right. So, timeline, obviously they were looking at only a few months. So, half a month for what do we say setting up the system, and then flooding the system with water initially, and then for around 40 days or so they inject the relevant system with fresh surfactant, right, with fresh surfactant. That is something to keep in mind, with fresh surfactant, right. And then they again flood the relevant system with recycled surfactants, that is a total of 37 plus 10, so 47 days let us say, right. So, total of 47 days I guess they were flushing the relevant system with the surfactant let us say, right. That is something to keep in mind. So, and looks like they again extended the recycle or flooding with 10 more days with the recycled surfactant. So, I am now going to end up with 57 days more or less, right. And then they were obviously pumping the relevant surfactant out, and then they pumped water in again for 34 days let us say, right. So, water flooding and then tracer injection obviously to look at the relevant aspects, as in you want to know let us say sometimes if paths that were flow paths that were available earlier maybe were clogged now or such. So, they also want to look at the relevant aspects among other aspects anyway, right. So, tracer injection and again flooding water, more flooding of the relevant water, right, and this is again a particular post treatment based sampling let us say, right. And here they are taking the system down, right, and I believe what May, June, July, August, so 4 months or 4.5 months let us say, or here I have more number of days here I guess, right. But I believe around 5 months was the effective time if I am not wrong, right, and they were able to look at or the demonstration of this pilot scale plant let us say, right. So, let us move on. So, surfactant flow rates, just to get an idea about it. So, I believe we had a set of injection wells and flanked by different rows of extraction wells, and also two what we say wells for hydraulic control let us say, right. So, just different flow rates during flooding 1 and 2 let us say, right. So, 27, 30, 30, 60 days more or less, and water flooding let us say, right. They looked at water flooding, 2 phases of water flooding, and again the PITT phase let us say, right. And what do we have out here? So, as you can see I guess depending upon the heterogeneity of the system you can't have the same flow rates everywhere. Initially they start out with particular flow rates for one set of injection wells and another for another set of injection wells. And how do they go about it? They go about it based on initial models let us say, right. And obviously based on the performance during this particular injection system or cycle, they are going to modify the relevant injection rates let us say, or flow rates during the relevant or subsequent cycle let us say, right. So, initially they start out with 2 different sets of flow rates for the 2 different sets of injection wells, and then typically higher as you would expect for the extraction wells and for the hydraulic control, right. And then as you can see during the second phase though, they modified that slightly based on obviously their or the lessons learned during the first phase. They modified the relevant flow rates during the second phase. But again the trends are that obviously as you can see extraction wells they typically have higher flow rates let us say, right, and also obviously hydraulic control in this case based on the relevant permeability or the relevant heterogeneity of the system now let us say, right. So, with respect to water again same case, right. Relatively higher what we say injection rates for one set of injection wells compared to the other, and then much higher extraction rates for the water, and then again for hydraulic control let us say, right. Even phase 2 I guess they modified that slightly or actually brought about more homogeneity in the system. I guess once the system was flooded with water they could afford to do so, and that is what we have here, relatively similar profile let us say, right. So, we are going to move on. Again depending upon the heterogeneity of the system you need to obviously be able to tailor the relevant flow rates I guess, right. So, that is what we have out here. So, again before we dig further we will have a quick look again at what we have. So, to achieve hydraulic control they had 2 such particular wells, as you can see hydraulic control well, and then you have the injection wells out here, right, that is what you have, and you also have the extraction wells, right, extraction wells and the recovery wells during I believe the PITT phase let us say, right. So, let us move on. So, again before we move on though we have one set of injection wells and then flanked by what do we say 2 rows of extraction wells, right. So, let us move on out here. PCE concentrations at a particular monitoring well, we also had different what do we say monitoring wells. So, at a particular monitoring well we have this data. First let us look at what we have. We have something in April and then in August let us say, right, more or less from the start to the end of the particular this particular demonstration cycle let us say, and we have concentrations in milligram per liter remarkably high. Obviously here we are looking at very high concentrations, right. So, either these are these are maybe just above the relevant DNAPL phase let us say, right. So, as you can see the concentrations are very high, and then you see a relevant trend in or decreasing trend, let's say, right, and that's something to keep in mind now, right. But one aspect that needs to be kept in mind is that this is not a linear scale, this is a logarithmic scale, as in here is 10,000 and here it's 1000. So when I compare these two data points, this and this, it means that it's almost 10 times less, let's say, right. So it's to 100 times less out here, and so compared to the initial case I have 1, 2, 3, almost 1,000 times lesser value out there, let's say, by the end of my particular cycle now, right. So that's something to keep in mind, yes. And PCE concentrations at different monitoring well, again we have relatively high concentrations out here, but in the other one, let's say, not as high removal, again that's because of heterogeneity in the particular system, let's say, right. You have the DNAPL, you have and some of it in the relevant water, some of it also in the relevant adsorbed onto the soil. And also again keep in mind that this was only a particular pilot scale study, let's say, right. So again, though they were able to achieve almost 100 times lesser concentrations, as you can see, right, 10 times and further 10 times, 100 times lesser concentration, and again that's something worthwhile, let's say, to consider, let's say, when you are going to look at scaling it up now, right. So we are going to move on. So another particular well, I guess, right. But here you see some rebound, if I may say so, right, and again more or less similar profiles. But again keep in mind that the location of the relevant monitoring wells, if you looked at the relevant figure earlier, wasn't symmetrical or such, and also you need to overlay the relevant plume or the DNAPL plume, let's say, right, over that particular site and then look at it, as in there was a building out here, right, and the plume was something like this, right, and they were only trying to look at this particular stretch or part, let's say, right. So obviously the profile of what do we say, the groundwater concentrations, let's say, of PCE, the PCE in the groundwater concentrations are going to be relatively different. So again, we are not trying to match the relevant data with respect to the particular site location, because we did not have as much data, and more importantly this is a pilot scale study limited to a particular area only, right. Again so you see rebound now, it could be due to what is it now, desorption from the soil or movement of what do we say, the DNAPL, or dissolution of some of the DNAPL. There are various reasons why you can see maybe some increase, let's say, right. But again at this particular level you see that the concentrations were also initially relatively low, right. So relatively low, right, that's something to keep in mind, as in most often not if you remember or if you can recall the data from the relevant two or previous or preceding data sets, let's say, right, we were more or less around these concentration ranges. So initially at this particular well we were anyway at low concentrations, and that's one of the reasons for this particular system to not have achieved further removal, let's say, right. Again there are various factors at play, right. So again moving on, so PCE concentrations in the extraction wells, right. So before we go further, let's understand what we are doing now. Let's say we looked at different monitoring wells and how, let's say, the concentration changed. Typically it decreased. Why is that? You have the surfactant that's being pumped in, and over time let's say the concentration would be removed, let's say. How is that? The particular surfactant would act as a particular media, let's say, or phase for where this particular hydrophobic PCE can be transformed into. The PCE that was earlier in the form of just PCE or dissolved in water or adsorbed in soil is now in the micelle phase in the relevant surfactant, let's say, right. So that's something to keep in mind. Here what are we looking at? The concentration in the extraction wells, right. So what would you expect? Initially you would expect a lot higher what do we say, concentrations, meaning more or less mass 2, right, and then more or less as you remove the PCE that's already present in the relevant soil, let's say, right, you are going to see lesser and lesser concentrations out there, right. So let's look at what we have. We have on the y-axis the PCE concentration. Keep in mind these are extraction wells, and again from March to relevant August period, let's say, right. We are looking at 3 extraction wells, right. So extraction level 1, 2 and 3. So you see that typically there is a peak that's achieved and then it flattens out, again a relative peak and then flattening out, and more or less maybe similar profile here for the same all the 3 wells, let's say, right. So initially let's say you are going to have time required for equilibrium to be reached, right, and then once the equilibrium is reached and more of the PCE starts dissolving, you hit the peak. That's what you see here. Again this is the concentration that they recovered from that particular surfactant, all right. So more concentrations were removed here, but as you keep moving further down with respect to the time, let's say, what's going to happen now, right? So you have some concentration of PC in the water or in the soil or in the NaPl, right? And you have some concentration of the PC in the micelle or in the surfactant, let's say. So here they are at equilibrium, let's say, right? So over time what will happen now, as more and more mass moves from these three phases into the surfactant, you see the mass out here is going to decrease, let's say. So then even the concentration of the relevant PCE in equilibrium with this particular system will also be less. As this moves less further down, again further down, right? So typically that's what you would see out here, you know, more or less relevant to the relevant equilibrium aspects, let's say, between all the four phases here, right? Let's move on. So again in a different extraction well, right, set of extraction wells 4, 5, 6, and again similar trend, you hit peaks and then decrease, peaks and relevant decrease, peaks and relevant decrease, let's see. Again keep in mind that the system is relatively heterogeneous, right, and again that is why you see somewhat slightly different profiles, but what you see typically initially you see relatively high concentrations, let's say, that are sustained for some period of time, and then the concentration that is in the extractant drops off, let's say, right. So let's move on. So PC predicted concentrations and the field what do we say concentrations from the extraction well 1 now, right. So before you start, you know, running your system, let's say, you are obviously going to look at some relevant models, let's say, right. How will models be relevant, or you know, why are they useful, let's say, right. Obviously there are different variables at play here or aspects that need to be estimated before you set up the system. As in, based on the model you will know how to design your treatment system, let's say, how much surfactant to be used, let's say, for how long you need to keep pumping it, and so on and so forth. So for that you are going to have models, let's say, right, that you can look at or use to predict. Let's see how good they were in predicting the actual field data, let's say, right. So here we have dissolved PCE concentration, and here we have, let's say, again we are looking at extraction well 1 and time since the surfactant injection, initially in days, right. So we see a period of almost around 140 or 150 days. They looked at two models, right, 1 and 2, right. One is out here, the red colored one, and then this dark blue colored one, right. Obviously this one maybe did not do as well. I think this is relevant to the relevant depths, let's say, or such, but we did not have enough information to be able to you know, look into it in more detail. But as you see, this particular model was able to predict the relevant or actual field concentrations or actual observed concentrations later on pretty well, let's say, right. So again how will this help, let's say, if you have a model that works fine, let's say, right, your estimates now are going to be estimates, and the relevant aspects that you use, let's say, or assumptions that you make based on that model are going to be relatively accurate. If not, you might be way off, and thus either underestimating or overestimating, and thus allocating more resources, or maybe not planning and you know, not having planned in the right manner, let's say, right. So obviously, you know, models play a critical role, right. So let's move further. So again, predicted and field surfactant concentration from extraction well 1, right. Here obviously surfactant concentrations. So this is surfactant concentration in on the y-axis, and time since injection, obviously we looked at around 140 or 150 days, that is what we have here. So initially during the flooding phases, let us say, I think they were around 60 days. So until this period, right, the system was flooded for around 60 days and so on. So you see that, you know, the concentration, the actual concentrations, let us say, obviously increased, and once the flooding stopped and they flushed the system with water, during that phase obviously the surfactant concentration would come down, let us say, right. That is what you would expect, and obviously that is what the relevant model predicted too, right. There is some difference, but again the relevant model was you know, is, as you can see, or was relatively accurate enough, let us say, right. So again, what is this up to, let us say, initially let us say you have only the surfactant, and I think it was around for 50, the surfactant flooding was done for around 57 days. So you see relatively higher concentrations, and then obviously once you stop that particular flooding and just water, that is why you see the relevant concentration of surfactant to drop, let us see, and this is just the residual concentration of the surfactant that is present in the relevant system, let us say, right. So let us move on. So this is from, and they also looked at another what do we say, one solvent, isopropyl alcohol, right. So again same case here, initially they injected along with the surfactant the isopropyl alcohol, the solvent, and as you can see the model did a decent job in predicting this particular behavior of the relevant what do we say solvent here, right. And again here during what do we say the flooding with water, you see you still have considerable considerable concentrations of the relevant what is this now, the isopropyl alcohol. So what could be some of the reasons, let's say, right? Keep in mind that's relatively more hydrophobic, let's say, right? And thus getting that out might have been an issue, getting that out of the relevant system, because you are flooding it with the water, right? Or if there is considerable organic carbon present on the relevant soil, let's say, some of the isopropyl alcohol might be absorbed onto the relevant soil though. Right, but typically, you know, isopropyl alcohol is typically biodegradable, so that's something to keep in mind, right? So predicted and field concentrations from extraction well 1, that's something that we just looked at, right? So here we have the isopropyl alcohol and surfactant concentrations initially, let's say, right? And you see the levels in which that they were present or, you know, injected by percentage by weight, and again you see logarithmic scale. So as you can see, it's the concentration, let's say, is almost 10 times or so higher, let's say, right? So that's something to keep in mind. Let's say they put in quite a lot of the isopropyl alcohol now, right? So let's move further. This is for the second monitoring well, let's say, right? And here again considerable but not as high a level of isopropyl alcohol, but they still put in considerable surfactant. And obviously, let's say after the end of this particular 60-day period, you see that the surfactant concentration obviously, you know, comes down. And why is that? Obviously because they were flooding the system with water and there is no more source of the relevant surfactant or the isopropyl alcohol out here, right? So that's something to keep in mind. This is the data from the relevant monitoring wells now, right? So let's move forth. So again another particular monitoring well, again keep in mind that the system is pretty what do we say, pretty heterogeneous, right? And that's what you see out here again. But again here keep in mind that the graphs are that these are relatively lower concentrations, or the axis is different compared to the previous two graphs. And again the concentration of solvent, this was the residual concentration that we saw even earlier, right? And getting out this residual concentration of isopropyl alcohol seems to be relatively difficult. But with respect to surfactant, you know, most of it, let's say, again was removed, let's say, right? And that was the case out here. So here we are also going to look at fraction of PC removed by per-evaporation unit. And why is this necessary to look at, let's say, because if you remember for almost 20 days they were re-injecting the recycled surfactant into the system now, right? So obviously you want to look at those aspects, let's say, such as how easy it is to separate the surfactant, the solvent from the relevant what is this now, the PCE now, right? So and also how easy is it to recycle that and so on. So obviously that's one particular aspect. So you want this particular efficiency to be relatively high. So here axis is from, keep in mind, 0.92 to 2.1. So typically as you can see here, the fraction removed is typically around 95, right, or 95% of the relevant PCE was removed, right? So that's a pretty high removal that was achieved, let's say, right? So this particular per-evaporation unit did its job pretty well, and that's something to keep in mind, let's say. So after this particular surfactant enhanced act for remediation, soil borings were also looked at, and so now they looked at different soil borings here, as you can see, right? To understand the particular system, they, you know, obviously they also want to look at this particular data, let's say, to be able to understand, you know, if, let's say, surfactant has been absorbed onto the relevant what is this now, soil, or if there is still considerable level of PCE adsorbed onto the soil, or even isopropyl alcohol or such. They want to look at the relevant behavior, let's say, and that's what we have out here. And again, as we mentioned earlier, only a part of this particular contaminated site was looked at. So that's, you know, as in the DNAPL plume was something like this, if I am not wrong, right? And you know, only a part of this particular site was looked at, let's say, or maybe it was something like this. Anyway, we can look at the relevant data, right? This was the contaminated DNAPL plume, and this is the site that they looked at, let's say, right? So let's move on. So post here DNAPL saturation at various depths within the well field. Let's look at what we have. So after remediation, so keep in mind here we have at different particular depths out here, we have the relevant saturation. As we saw, the saturation, you know, was considerably high, again especially at lower depths, right? So as you can see, this is again still after remediation, but keep in mind mostly they injected it at a particular depth only, right? So obviously you will not see a lot of removal, let's say, but again the picture would have been clearer if we had, let's say, before remediation what was the relevant picture, but we could not get that clear data, at least with respect to the relevant depth, let us say, right. So, that is something to keep in mind. So, as you can see here, there is still considerable PCE left, but the relevance of this particular PCE or this remediation, let us say, will be clear now when you compare that, as you keep going further down. Earlier you knew that there was much more PCE, but obviously as you can see now, let us say now as you go further down, let us say the PCE concentrations are not as high as you would have expected based on the relevant initial data now, let us say, right. And that is what you see out here, but obviously the heterogeneous system. So, you see the injection wells out here, right, and the extraction wells out here, let us say, right. These are the relevant locations here, let us say, right. And again keep in mind that the system is pretty what do we say pretty heterogeneous out there, and I guess you have different zones and such, but for pilot scale, let us say, that is I guess decent what do we say a decent level of removal, but we are going to look at the data. But here we get the picture that let us say obviously not all the relevant aspects are removed, or at least let us say there is still considerable DNAPL left, right. Again, why is that? If you keep in mind, let us say under that particular building there was still a considerable pool of DNAPL, and they were looking at removing this particular DNAPL that was outside the boundary of the building now. So, as they were removing the DNAPL from that particular site, obviously some of the DNAPL from the relevant what is this now under the building will move towards that particular site. So, you have those issues. So, obviously it is a relatively mixed picture out here, but obviously at 18.75 and 18.65, let us say, you can look at the relevant differences out here, right. Again, as you go further down, you see the different pictures. Again, that is because they injected the relevant surfactant at different depths and so on and so forth, let us say, right. And let us move on. So, what are the relevant aspects, let us say, that one needs to be concerned with respect to the cost and performance, let us see. As we mentioned multiple times, obviously heterogeneity will lead to greater complexity in the system and thus greater level of control. We will look at them. And again, part of the relevant aspect typically includes permeability, let us say, right, of the relevant system. And then again another aspect typically that might go in within the context of heterogeneity is the variation in the static hydraulic gradient, let us say, right. So, these are different aspects. So, within the context of permeability, what do you have? So, you need to look at the composition of the surfactant formulation, let us say, right. Obviously, let us say depending upon the hydraulic conductivity or let us say the permeability, let us say, you need to choose different types of surfactants or different mixes of surfactants, let us say, right. And as a design of the surfactant flood, how long and how to go about it and so on, right. Typically how long design, I guess, typically is about how long, and that obviously is covered out here, flooding duration, and obviously relevant cost, let us say, because the more time that is required for what do we say pumping the relevant aquifer, let us say, or the contaminated soil, let us say, with the DNAPL, relevant costs, let us say, are going to increase. That is what you see out here. And with respect to heterogeneity, let us say, again as we discussed earlier, it impacts the design of the surfactant flood, let us say, right. As in, let us say, if I have this is the side view, let us say, and I have this particular layer, and then let us say this is of clay, and my DNAPL has permeated or diffused into this clay layer, and let us say beside that I have a relatively sandy layer. So, now when I pump my surfactant through this particular site, what happens? Obviously, because of the differing hydraulic conductivities, let us say, first surfactant might go through this particular sandy layer, let us say, or silty layer, right, while bypassing this clay layer. But again clay, there might be considerable fraction of the DNAPL present in it now. So, how will that be removed now? Only when the surfactant has removed that particular DNAPL in the relevant sand layer will again diffusion take place out of the clay into the sand, right. So, that is going to take place, diffusion out of the clay into the sand, and then again as you pump more out, it is going to go out, be taken out, right. So, these are relevant aspects. So, again any other chemical requirements, the sweep efficiency, obviously that is something we talked about, and also DNAPL removal efficiency, right. All these will be impacted by heterogeneity, let us say, right. Again variation in static or hydraulic gradients, obviously in designing your hydraulic control, the sweep efficiency and DNAPL removal efficiency, right. These are relevant aspects, let's say, right. So let's keep moving. So to get an idea about what we have looked at, I believe we did look at this number earlier, what we have been up to, or they have been up to rather. They looked at, or pumped enough particular surfactant to fill 6,000 gallons or 22,700 liters of pore space or pore volume, right. So considerable amount of surfactant obviously was pumped through. And how much NaPl did they remove? Here they removed 76 and plus or minus 9 gallons, and they estimate that there is still 29 plus or minus 9 gallons remaining in that particular system now, right. So again you get an idea about the amount of surfactant required to be able to remove DNAPL. And again, even from our particular equilibrium calculations, we see that considerable amount of surfactant has to be pumped through. But if you look at it, the time period and the relevant control, it's relatively not as difficult as you would presume it to be too. But if keep in mind that a considerable amount of DNAPL was removed, and if you remember some of the calculations that we looked at far earlier in the class, let's say, right, we looked at cases where even very minor fractions, minor volumes of the relevant DNAPL, let's say, could lead to considerable, what do we say, effects, let's say, on, let's say, groundwater concentrations and concentrations of the contaminant in the soil, let's say, right, or adsorbed onto soil. So again, removing this non-aqueous phase liquid is considerably important and tricky, let's say, and as you can see, they did a pretty good job by removing almost around 75% of the relevant contaminant here, right. So again, what were the post-shear conditions? They say that they were elevated, right, or rebounded, let's say, again typically because keep in mind that you have other contaminant at different levels, or not other contaminant at different levels, or contaminant in the different areas, let's say, right, because the relevant people only trial it at a particular location, right. And also they saw that PCE was being reductively dechlorinated in the aquifer, right, PCE and DCE, right. And how did they know that? Because 1,2-DCE, which is what do we say, a byproduct, was present at significant concentrations at several locations, and also the solvent that they injected, which was isopropyl alcohol, looks like is also degrading or biodegrading. That is based on the relevant what is it now, byproduct out here, let's say, right. So that is something to keep in mind, or there could be a symbiosis between these two aspects, let's say, right. So what are some of the generic design criteria, let's say? We will quickly go through these relevant aspects. Obviously spend considerable amount of resources on zone characterization, as in, is there NaPl present? If so, where is it present and what is its location, let's say, right, that is something else. And getting this is a tricky aspect. And then site characteristics with respect to permeability and hydraulic conductivity, let's say, right. For the depth of the aquifer and for the saturated thickness, that is something to keep in mind. Because in our case, if you remember, some of the DNAPL was above the impermeable layer and also some of it inside the impermeable layer. So obviously it is pretty difficult to get such a particular NaPl out, and obviously we need to get such information, let's say. Is the aquifer layered within with a high permeability contrast between the various layers? Again, we are looking at the heterogeneity of the relevant system, which is which was the case in this particular scenario, let's say, right. And again, is there a barrier to downward NaPl at the site? Why is that? Otherwise, the DNaPl might permeate to great depths, and that might increase the relevant what do we say, complexity of the system. Here I believe in our particular case, or the information that we had was around 16 or so feet below the ground surface. They had a relevant clay layer, let's say, I believe, or silty clay layer that served as an impermeable layer to hold the, or to inhibit further downward movement of the DNaPl, let's say, right. So that is something we looked at. And then obviously surfactant selection, right. First, obviously, is it toxic by itself? Obviously that you saw that residual concentrations of surfactant were present. So you need to see that you are not introducing a problem. So obviously that is one aspect. So is the surfactant acceptable, or is that biodegradable, right. So again, different aspects with respect to solubilization or mobilization, let's say, depending upon the remedial objectives, right. And does the surfactant electrolyte NaPl system reach equilibrium rapidly? So why is this important, let's say? So you have the NaPl present, and then you have surfactant being flooded through, right. If it takes a lot of time for equilibrium to be achieved, as in for the compound or the PCE to change phase from the NaPl into the surfactant, then what will that lead to? That will lead to requirement for greater flooding period, let's say, right. that will mean more time, more cost and so on, right. So, you would prefer that the kinetics that are required for this change in phase are relatively rapid, let us say, right. So, here they looks like they typically look at several hours or less than 24 hours at best, let us say, right. And salinity requirement, is it within the acceptable levels, obviously, right. Required co-solvent here, which is the isopropyl alcohol, the cost acceptable. Surfactant regeneration is desired, as we discussed earlier. Surfactant have the necessary characteristics for filtration. They look at obviously change in phase separation. So, obviously surfactant, if you are trying to regenerate that should obviously meet such needs, let us say, right. So, let us move on. So, column tests are to be conducted, let us say, as in one way we are looking at this particular behavior from phase change behavior, right. We have micelle, we have the NaPl or surfactant and NaPl. You are seeing that okay, there is going to be a transfer taking place. So, that obviously again needs to be done on the soil column test, let us say, right, to be able to confirm that. And is there any pressure increase during soil column testing, as in let us say, as we discussed briefly, is this particular surfactant leading to clogging of the relevant pores, right, then the pressure required will increase obviously, right, and that is what you see, or is this particular surfactant adsorbing onto the soil and so on and so forth, right. So, the relevant aspects, and again the relevant model development, let us say this is required for obviously predicting the relevant aspects upon which let us say you will base the calculations for your resources and planning, right. So, hydraulic containment being accomplished, right, that is something we looked at, let us say, and is it how heterogeneous is the relevant site, let us say, right, because the more complex the system, typically the models, let us say, they are going to have a difficult job and being able to predict the relevant aspects, let us say, right. And again, how much pore volume are we required to remove? In our case, I think we looked at 6,000 gallons, let us say, right. And duration of flooding is sufficient to accomplish acceptable recovery of injected surfactants and co-solvents, let us say, right. So, that is something to keep in mind, as in initially we looked at I think 57 days or almost 60 days, during which the system was flooded with the relevant what is this now, the relevant surfactant, let us say, and the co-solvent, which was isopropyl alcohol. And later for around 37 days or 47 days they flooded the system with water, and you saw that the profile of these two particular surfactant and such was something like initial increase and then decrease during the water flooding, right. So, from the model you will be able to need to predict how much time is required for this water flooding to bring down the relevant residual concentrations of these particular surfactants to reasonable limits, right. So, that is what you have out here, right. So, I guess with that I will end my particular presentation or the particular case study, right. So, obviously as you can see there are quite a few aspects involved, right, and it is relatively complex to remove a particular DNAPL contaminated site, let us say, right. If you can look at bioremediation, but that will be typically more effective if for the soil or the groundwater contamination. But if you have DNAPL present, that obviously is going to act as a great reservoir, let us say, for the contaminant. So, typically your efforts should be directed at removing that particular pure solvent, let us say, or such, let us say, right. And I guess with that I bid adieu and thank you.